Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is Lotus Notes 360 presented by Francie Tanner from Panagenda. She's the technical director for the Americas. I know she's very famous and I'm sure everyone's here for her, so I won't take up too much time here in the introduction. But again, thank you for attending today. As a reminder, there'll be questions and answers at the end of her presentation. So if you do have questions along the way or something pops to your mind as she's talking about a specific topic, go ahead and expand your GoToWebinar control panel and you'll be able to type in your questions and they'll be queued up for me at the end of the presentation. So that's without further ado then, we'll go ahead and I'll turn the time over to Francie.
All right, and let's be honest, nobody's here to listen to me. You guys are here to enter for the drawing of a ticket for Lotusphere, which is now called Connect. However, the point of today's session basically is to hopefully pass on some knowledge while you guys are doing that. So the topic is Lotus Notes 360. What I wanted to do was tell you guys about the kind of the life of a Lotus Notes client from the beginning to end, when you first start setting up notes, kind of what's involved, and then how we as Panagenda can help with every step of the way. Okay, just real quick, we as Panagenda are actually more than MarvelClient. We have 6 different solutions that help you identify and solve problems at various levels of your infrastructure. Basically, the only products that we're going to be working with today is on the bottom right, called MarvelClient. But as you can see, we have things like Smart Changer that deals with the insides of Lotus Notes application, Group Explorer, which does an ACL and group analysis, Database Explorer, fairly self-explanatory, reaches into your code, Greenlight, which does environment server as well as client monitoring, Notes to Web, which does conversion of code. But again, MarvelClient is essentially the solution that you can use to help set up, modify, fix whatever your Lotus Notes clients. We as Panagenda currently have 35 partners all over the world, so while I don't actually know where each one of you guys is from, I can assure you that we have business partners ready to help you with any questions that you may have. All right, now let's talk about the actual topic, the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So as part of the Notes client life cycle and all the struggles that you're going to encounter during this, first comes the beginning, right? The beginning of a Notes client. What does that mean? Well, it depends. If you have brand new users, that means that typically a user ID is already created and lives somewhere, which could be either an ID vault, maybe it's a file share, maybe you just saved the user IDs to a dominant directory, but there's an ID somewhere, and typically this means that Notes is installed on a workstation but not configured. Now, the beginning of a Lotus Notes client might also mean this is an existing user that has an existing Notes ID, data, plugins, journals, signatures, all kinds of things, but they're getting a new machine. So having a machine replacement, a machine upgrade. We work with a lot of customers that do operating system upgrades. They just basically give users a new laptop or whatever, hardware replacements with a new image. Again, we're talking about Lotus Notes is installed but not configured. And this one's actually slightly more complicated because now you have to figure out how to get the old data to the new machine. So how do you deal with this? Well, typically, in the real world, I know what I used to do. This is actually how I got started in the glamorous world of IBM Lotus technology, is some technician somewhere spends, and I'm being really kind here, 30 to 60 minutes plus to configure a new machine. So even though Notes is installed, even though the data may or may not exist for the user, it's really kind of an involved process to set up those new machines. The more complex or the more heavily you use Lotus Notes, the more difficult this is. So for example, if we're talking about somebody that maybe does roaming in a warehouse, that's a completely different story and a completely different setup manual than somebody who is a traveling person with a laptop that needs a set of 25 databases replicated locally. So really what this kind of means is that setting up Lotus Notes client, and we haven't even really talked about replacements, but replacing or setting up new Notes users from scratch is partially a manual process. Yes, there's some things that you can do to help with that, but still the customization part, making sure that connections, locations, whatever, is streamlined, is still a very manual process. So manual basically means error-prone, which means there may or may not be any kind of real standardization. I had a customer call last week, a potential customer I should say, and they said, you know, we have a pretty good set of setup instructions, but the reality is, you know, people make mistakes. So we kind of end up with clients that are configured in a garden variety of ways. So of course doing this manually is also time intensive, which means this is a very expensive way to deal with technology, to kind of manually set it up for the different parts of your organization. Realistically, and we're going to hit this point over the head over and over throughout the presentation, there's no way to tell who is set up right or who is set up wrong. It's the issue and the big gap that IBM currently has of visibility. You can't actually tell if somebody did something wrong during this setup or not. And then lastly, old notes data may or may not be moved properly to new machines. I'm sure you guys have all seen this, heard of it, dealt with it in the past where old notes data just didn't make it across. People are missing databases, especially when people do silly things like, let's say they create an archive outside of the notes data directory. That is absolutely something that even a very gifted technician wouldn't be able to identify and see and port over to a new machine, for example. So, but let's pretend like we're working with flawless technicians. So let's pretend like we have now set up, somehow, we managed to set up, you know, hundreds of notes clients that are absolutely perfectly set up. Local replicas, archives, location documents, replicator page things, you know, mobile directory catalogs only being replicated one way, things like that. So then what happens when you give a user this workstation? Anyone? Anyone? Right. Users get this perfect notes client set up and they change stuff, right? We don't really understand why, we don't really always know how, but the reality is users do stuff. They click on things, they uncheck things, they enable ports or disable ports. That's a favorite one of mine. Uncheck TCP/IP, and then the help desk gets a call saying, you know, the server's down. No, it's not, but why did you do that? So users do things like moving icons out of sight, or maybe they have a wrong icon on the top of the stack on the workspace. They're pointing to something that they shouldn't be in bookmarks. You know, in reality, there's nothing stopping your users from adding bookmarks to a server that is geographically completely wrong, like in China or in Brazil. And then, you know, what happens based on that is Notes is slow. Well, right, yes it is if you're doing it wrong, basically. But things happen over the course of a Notes client. The reality is things happen. Location and connection documents get edited, get modified, and you know it's not always the users. So, and to be fair, it's not really the user's job to know about technology and to know about notes. That's your job. It's just that really, without a third-party tool, you don't necessarily have what you need to streamline on all this or fix it in the way that you would hope to. So let's say it is something simple like the home server no longer matches what is supposed to be in the user's location document, and that happens to have the unfortunate effect of policies now no longer work. So kind of, you know, some of these issues multiply as they happen to the users. That, of course, would cause, if the location document ended up being wrong, that, of course, ends up making issues on the replicator page. Now we're talking about orphaned replicas, and, you know, it just kind of gets worse from there. And now, going back to this kind of lack of visibility, this becomes really an even more significant issue, because before we couldn't see who wasn't set up properly originally, but now what we're interested in is who is set up wrong, you know, after their users get their hands on the Notes client. All right, so what can we do about this? One extremely important for all of you guys thing that we can help with is called MarvelClient Analyze. So MarvelClient has several different modules, which I'll introduce you to some during the course of this presentation. MarvelClient Analyze, which is my favorite module, and I don't just say that because it's free, but by the way, it's free, and it allows you to transparently and seamlessly identify and collect an inventory over 200 configuration points, such as who has notes installed, what kind of notes, where, including which hotfixes or which hotfixes they're missing, who is running Mac, Linux, Windows machines, performance issues, network latency. We do a runtime analysis, and I'm not expecting you to actually be able to read all the things on the right. But we do a runtime analysis. We can tell you exactly who has a slow-performing Notes client. And then additionally, we can answer the million-dollar question, which, of course, is why. So speaking of performance, you know, you always hear people saying Notes is slow. But, you know, what does that mean? And you saying Notes is slow could mean something completely different from me saying Notes is slow. Maybe my interpretation of Notes is slow means if it's not up and running in 5 seconds, you know, that's slow. But for somebody that doesn't have that kind of expectation, maybe that means 30 seconds. So really the point of all this is you don't know what's wrong today. You don't know who has a slow-running Notes client. You certainly don't know why without this particular tool. So MarvelClient Analyze can also help you identify potential security risks. So one of the things that we do is we inventory all local databases, which means NSFs, NTFs. We can tell you where they are, so inside the data directory, outside the data directory. Things like who has an unencrypted replica in a Dropbox folder. I mean, kind of very crazy things that may present a security risk to you guys. We also inventory all icons and bookmarks that your users have. So we can tell you who has workspace icons pointing to servers that you decommissioned 5 years ago, right? Or if you want to flip this the other way around, if you're going to consolidate 2 servers tomorrow, which users are going to be affected by that? We can also tell you all kinds of details such as location and connection documents, who has wrong location and connection documents, certificates, IDs. We can tell you about certificate expiration, single sign-on, no shared login users, and then additionally some optional hardware and software inventory. So this basically answers the question of we can't see what's out there. We don't know who was configured wrong. We don't know who maybe was configured right, but then which users changed things or which users are configured in a way that makes their workstation slow or is pointing to servers, applications that make no sense for the particular user. So this part is free. Shoot me an email. We'll work with Scott. All we need, the process of making this happen for you guys is very easy. Okay, so how do we deal with the rest of the stuff? So we can see now, which is great, but that's only part of the real solution, right? So once you can see the problem, that's great, but now we want to fix it. So how do you fix the issue of having to manually set up all your Notes users? How do you then kind of go above that and make sure that my Notes users are configured correctly on day 2 of the Notes client's life, right? So what MarvelClient Manage allows you to do is it allows you to define whatever you consider to be the perfect Notes client. for any group, hardware type, notes version, whatever, geography, department, OU, you name it. So for example, you can define what you consider to be a perfect notes client for that roaming guy in the warehouse. And you can configure what you consider to be the perfect notes client for a remote Salesforce person that needs those 25 local replicas and the workspace configured in a certain way, and maybe needs to be, redirected to a DMZ server when they connect via VPN. So whatever that is, MarvelClient Manage allows you to identify all these things and then basically apply it. So we're talking about things including Eclipse plugins, widgets, location, connection documents, notes INI settings, local replicas, bookmarks, preferences, blah, blah, blah. You can read that part for yourself. So basically any part of notes you can identify and then apply. And we're talking all the way from scratch. So we have one customer that actually just converted 3,000 users from Outlook to Notes, and what they wanted to do was just roll out an image and be done. And really, really fun project. We were able to help them with MarvelClient Manage and a couple of other modules. Basically, the first time the brand new Notes user double-clicked on the Notes icon, MarvelClient downloaded the ID from the ID vault for the particular user. It set up Notes exactly how they wanted the very first time, including local replicas and things like custom directories and the names equals a line in the Notes INI, things like that. So basically, we could do touchless Notes setups, which works the exact same way for brand new machine or replacement machines. So replacement client setups, getting someone a new laptop, helping someone recover from a blown up hard disk, something like that, is 100% reliable and error-free, and of course a whole lot faster, and not something that you no longer need to babysit. And the best thing is, since all MarvelClient actions can be set up to execute once, a number of times or persistently, basically this allows you to make sure that your Notes clients are not only deployed perfectly, but that they remain perfectly configured 365 days a year. So this is kind of the self-healing stuff that we talk about sometimes, where we can say this perfectly set up location document, which basically goes out and does a lookup to the user's home server every time Notes starts. Go ahead and execute that every time Notes starts, which basically means even if you ever move the particular user, this means even if you if the user makes an error and they mess up the location document, that MarvelClient will always, at every Notes startup, heal itself, therefore preventing over 80% of your help desk calls, which is really tremendous. So not only can we kind of help fix things, but really even better than just fixing is being able to prevent problems to begin with. We can also manage ID files. I talked about that just a little bit earlier in a reliable and secure way. We do have our own optional ID vault-like storage facility. So a lot of companies have issues with ID vaults because it's tied into policies, and we'll talk about the problem with policies, or some of the problems of policies, in a little bit. So what we can do is collect all ID files and upload them to basically wherever you like to be used or downloaded later. Okay, so we've just talked about kind of the Notes setup originally, or as a replacement machine. Let's talk about some of the things that you guys do kind of in the adolescence of the Notes client. And really the only constant with regards to life, technology, you name it, is that everything changes. So kind of regardless of what you guys do with Notes, at some point or another in the past, present, or future, you're going to do a server consolidation or a server decommissioning. This, as you know, impacts your workspace, it impacts your locations, connection documents, replicator page entries, same-time communities, on and on and on. It really changes everything where the user has a pointer to a certain application. Depending on who you are, you may also be doing a merger or maybe a recertification, or maybe the company got renamed and now you need to deal with this in Notes, which is huge because every single thing, every element in Notes is signed with a certain certifier or OU. Or we can just talk about a single user rename, right? So if somebody changes their name, even that has a huge effect on the person's Notes client environment as location documents and email addresses and things like that change. And then, of course, new features get introduced. So whether that is you're looking at virtualization, you're looking at Citrix or anything like that, maybe you have a Eclipse plugin that you wanted to get deployed. Maybe it's a Lotus Notes help or how-to application that you want to give to those brand new 3,000 Notes users that have never used Notes before. Or maybe you're interested in roaming. I talked about a fictional warehouse guy earlier. Maybe you have a call center or something like that, and that's a feature that you're interested in. So how do you deal with all this? Applications get deployed, so kind of just like servers, applications come and go. Maybe you have a new expense reporting app. Maybe the expense reporting app gets moved. So again, we're talking about client changes that happen that are easy to deal with on the server, but get a little bit more complex when we talk about the impact of that on your clients. Users and apps get moved, so moving users, mail files, things like that. Now we're talking about location documents and bookmarks and workspace pages and replicator pages pointing to the wrong thing, which can really have a significant domino effect on the particular user's Notes client. Now all of a sudden we may or may not have orphaned mail files and things like that. Or maybe you're looking to upgrade. So new software is released, client needs to be upgraded, so hot fixes come out fairly constantly. How do you deploy that to users all the time? Maybe you're moving from map network drives. You remember that, the kind of old-fashioned roaming that I think pretty much everybody used to do, where everybody had their Notes data on the H drive or whatever. Maybe you are finally looking to get away from that and moving to a true local install. Maybe the working directory changes, and I say maybe, yes, the working directory changes all the time, not with every version of the Notes client, but kind of, right? These are things that really impact how your Lotus Notes clients are set up. And then, of course, changes in preferences, maybe from a shared client you want to move to single user client or the other way around. So how do we deal with all this? Well, one of the ways that we all have natively are policies. So I don't really go into policies a huge amount in this particular presentation, and by all means do not misinterpret anything I'm saying as don't use policies. Please use policies, because there are some really excellent policies that do things that, you know, MarvelClient doesn't even touch. So like security things, you know, we don't deal in that neighborhood. So don't misunderstand anything I'm saying as don't use policies. But what I do want you to be is aware of the challenges that you have with policies, so you basically know how all that works. And I suspect you guys already know this anyway. But to a large degree, policies depend on an already functioning and quote-unquote perfectly set up Notes client. And what does that mean? Well, there's actually about 10 different factors involved in that, but things like your location document needs to point to the right place, things like your names in SF needs to play along. I'm sure you guys have all seen kind of a stuck or corrupted dollar policies view in a user's local names in SF, which then prevents that particular user from pulling down any policies. So in my experience, typically we're talking about a 70% or so success rate with people that are getting policies. And again, you know, the real issue, or an even bigger issue than here's people with a problem, is you don't know which people have a problem. So all you can kind of do with policies is adjust things and hope for the best. They don't truly adapt to your user's unique situation. I know in the latest version of Notes there's a little bit of awareness there that doesn't work terribly well, but we're kind of getting there. So, but policies cannot adjust to your user's unique situation. So, for example, right now, where I'm sitting to my left, I have a Mac laptop. What I'm working on right now is a Windows workstation, and then on my right, I have a Windows laptop where I'm doing virtualization things. So, when we're talking about applying a policy to me as a user, that's not necessarily the same thing. So me on a Mac, I may not need the same policy or the same configurations and preferences as me on Windows, and certainly not me on virtual. So if you have a whole bunch of Citrix users, for example, the last thing you want to do is deploy those 25 local replicas that I talked about earlier. So really, one of the issues with policies is me as a user may not be the smartest way to manage things. Really kind of where I'm going with this is you're wanting to look at me as a condition or a certain situation. Me on a Mac is one thing, and then me in Citrix is another, and then me on Windows is yet another. And if we throw geography in there, it gets really interesting. So me on the East Coast of the U.S. is totally different than me on a dial-up modem in Brazil. So policies can't really truly adapt to all the different user situations, which can be a drawback. And additionally, they're not terribly predictable. So there's actually a great article online that made me laugh in a wiki, where somebody asked, so when exactly do the different policies apply? And the official IBM answer was, well, it depends. We don't really know because it's not terribly consistent. So they're not truly predictable, so it's not like you can say, well, tomorrow when everybody gets to the office, this is going to happen. But maybe it will, which is not that helpful. And then also one of the things that I want you guys to be aware of with regards to policies is that most settings cannot be unset once you set them. I had a very difficult learning experience with this one many years ago. You can set most things and then you can stop setting most things, but you can't necessarily go and unset the things you've already set, which may or may not turn into a really ugly situation depending on what you're doing. Lastly, policies typically can't repeat actions. Some policies can. Again, some of this depends on how your users are set up to begin with, but typically they can't. So how can we help? How can we help with the whole, you're going to consolidate and migrate and rename servers? Well, there's a couple things we can help you with. MarvelClient Migrate basically transparently adjusts any kind of client pointers that you have. We're talking about workspace icons, bookmarks, replicator page entries, actually going as deep as replication history to really help you deal with particularly server consolidations, server decommissionings, domain mergers, renames, recertifying, anything. And I included a sample of one of our actions. Basically, you can get very granular or not at all. You can change things. You can change and move things to the top of the stack. You can delete and adjust your client pointer landscape, basically, all remotely. I'll give you a really great example of a huge client that we helped with a project at the end of this presentation in our summary. But basically, being able to use this, and in conjunction with being able to schedule these things or kind of have them execute whenever you want, means you can kind of prepare for a server data center move that you're going to do 2 weeks from now. So you can have all these things deployed to where once you actually make the switch and you turn that server off or you actually move the application on the server side, all your clients are basically instantly adjusting to whatever it is you did. Okay, maybe one of the things that you're looking to go into at this part in the Notes client life is roaming. So in theory, notes roaming is really great, or actually the strategy is really great, allowing you to kind of take your notes data and downloading it somewhere else, which will help with kind of how we started talking about this topic, which is how kind of labor and time intensive it is to set up new machines or to give users new machines, right? Now the problem with notes-based roaming is that it can be very, very large, and I'm being also kind here in my numbers. For me, and I know that I'm an admin, I'm not exactly a normal user, but my workspace is 90 megabytes. So if you're roaming just my I don't know how big my address book is, but if you're roaming my workspace and my address book, you're already over 150 megs. And then, of course, what that means, if you're kind of replicating all this stuff up to a server and then down at a new workstation, that basically makes this whole thing extremely slow. Not only is it slow, but it's also network intensive. So imagine, let's pick a nice number, so 100 megs per person. And even in a relatively small company of 5,000 users, we're talking about a massive amount of data that you're kind of dragging around with you. So the impact to your network is absolutely tremendous here. Again, we kind of talked about some of the issues with policy. So anything related to policies basically means is not 100% reliable, which in this case means ID vault and roaming, which kind of makes this a not terribly good situation or way for you to deal with the topic of roaming. So this means it's not really reliable. We have customers that literally have hundreds of support calls because ID vault's not working, or it's not updating the user's IDs, or roaming isn't kicking in as expected. And then if we talk about Eclipse, which we'll talk about at more detail in just a little bit, but roaming Eclipse components is extremely difficult. Now we're talking about having to do additional restarts, which at every restart, you have to kind of replicate your changes back up and then pull them back down, so you're kind of intensifying this problem. So how can we help with this kind of situation? We have our own MarvelClient roaming module, which is extremely efficient and extremely small. And again, I'm not really expecting you to be able to read the stuff on the right, but by all means, if you would like a set of these slides, I'll be happy to share that with you. My contact information is at the end, and Scott can help you with that as well. But basically what we do is we kind of reverse engineer key components of the Notes client and then turn them into XML. So what that means for my 90 megabyte workstation, for example, once you take that 90 megabyte file and you turn it into XML, we're talking about maybe 50 kilobytes, listing all, whatever it is, 621 icons that I have across 12 workspace pages, for example. So what we do after we convert certain things into XML is we zip them. Anyone want to guess what a 55 kilobyte file zipped is, the size? I mean, it's ridiculous, really. We're talking about, maybe 5 kilobytes, and that's just for my workspace. So long story short, basically, because of the way we do things, because of the components that we grab, that we zip and then upload to either a network location of your choice or a Notes database, we can do full-fledged Notes roaming anywhere between 2 to 4 megabytes, which is a huge difference between this and the Notes roaming that can be as large as 150 megabytes, for example. So basically, because what we do is grab everything that makes your user's notes theirs, once we have that uploaded somewhere and you download it, whether that is for true actual Notes roaming or dealing with Citrix, going to from Citrix, or just roaming within Citrix, the other thing that we can do once we have this data, the user's signature, the user's journal, their dictionary, things like that, we can basically kind of do one-step upgrades. So you can easily use this to roam, anybody that's on Notes 6 that is now logging into Notes with 853, for example, you can basically do roaming and instant upgrades because we already ported all their notes data over. So now if we're talking about replacing users' workstation, this becomes incredibly easy. Not just easy, but cheap, speaking about the time, effort that is invested. The margin of error here is basically zero. This just happens, right? This is an automated thing that nobody needs to babysit. The technician has no chance of making an error and doing things like workstation replacement, hardware upgrades, all that stuff becomes incredibly easy. So what we're able to do with MarvelClient roaming is to save you guys up to 95% network traffic and disk space as well, depending on what you're doing. So whether that is just for notes roaming, or you're wanting to maybe roam your users' notes configuration from Notes to Citrix, or just within Citrix, we can do all that in an extremely efficient way. Also, if you're dealing with Notes clients with data directories on network drives, this helps a ton, because we zip all that stuff, and the amount of information that you have to deal with is a lot less, basically. And then lastly, this is network independent while the Notes client is running. So if we're talking about a Citrix install, for example, the only times where you need to have Citrix or a data directory on the network drive, the only time where you need to have network connectivity is in the beginning and at the end. Everything in between kind of doesn't really matter because we've already pulled down or uploaded the data. Okay, let's talk about a geography problem. Okay, geography problem in Notes could mean many different things. I talked earlier about, somebody has a link to a database pointing to the server in Brazil, which is a dial-up modem or whatever. And that's an extreme example, but the reality is that our Notes environments are pretty complex, and users do interesting things. That's a nice way of putting it. And then lastly, Notes is set up in a way where it may or may not always do the best thing for our end users' interest. So, for example, you guys are familiar with the catalog, right? It lists the location or the contents of every server. Maybe you have a global catalog that lists basically every application on every server. Except the problem with this is that it can really, really greatly mislead you. So let's just go through this hypothetical situation, which we see in the real world all the time. So a user in New York sends a doc link to somebody in California. Okay, so obviously geography there, we're assuming that there's a server on each coast, except what happens when the user in California clicks on that user doesn't open the application from the California server because the Notes client doesn't really understand that it has a version there already. But from that point forward, that user will now open this, let's say this is an expense reporting database, from the server in New York. So, kind of going back to the Notes is slow thing, do you guys see where some of these things are kind of artificially created? We're in this situation, if I'm connecting, cross-country to a server for a particular application, yes, Notes will be slow. Absolutely. And if we're talking about a database with a lot of views or a lot of data or whatever, you're kind of magnifying this problem. Now, but this is kind of exactly what the catalog or a global catalog was invented for, Francie. Why can't that help? Well, okay, so there's good news and bad news. If you have your users set up with a catalog in their location document, for example, going through the same scenario again, the user in New York sends an expense reporting database link to the user in California. The user in California clicks on that, and you know what would happen if they have a catalog server listed? The Notes client would look in that catalog server for the first match of that replication ID going in alphabetical order. Uh-oh. Okay, now we have a problem, because guess what? The first match for that particular application, which is the expense reporting one, is a server in Alaska. This is definitely not at all efficient. This is not at all what we had intended to do. What we wanted to do, or what we want to happen, is we want traveling users to kind of automatically adjust to point to applications that they're geographically closest to, and kind of be smart about it. But the Notes client doesn't work that way. And once you open that one database in Alaska, or China, or Brazil, or whatever it is, that icon is on the top, that bookmark is set. Yes, you can change it manually, but odds are most people don't pay attention to where these things are pointing to. And now you have an inefficiency problem, right? Okay, so how can we help with this? It's called MarvelClient Realtime. So what MarvelClient Realtime can do for you is optimize server connectivity by automatically and dynamically redirecting you to kind of the geographically closest or most ideal location for users. We could do things like identify or detect within the running Notes client session whether a user is on the LAN. We know whether you're on the WAN or on VPN, for example. What we can do is automatically adjust as people travel, and automatically point people to things like DMZ servers if a user connects to VPN, for example. This saves you guys a whole lot of bandwidth, a whole lot of frustration for the end users as well. Okay, talking about the mature Lotus Notes client. So we've kind of talked about some pretty major changes, consolidations, mergers, upgrades, whatever. Let's talk about upgrades real quick. How do you do a Notes upgrade? Okay, so we're kind of coming 360 here on this particular slide. We're back to the setting up new users, giving users a new machine, and then porting the data onto the new machine, which is kind of how we started talking about this topic. Again, we're back to looking at this from an overall point of view. How do you solve a problem that you don't really understand, that you can't see? So the MarvelClient Analyze comes in there again as well. So really what happens, what you guys are doing today, is you're forced to guess kind of what people have. Well, we think, or according to, whatever, what Joe told me when I was hired 2 years ago, our users have, whatever, Notes 8 or whatever it is, 801 with a particular fix pack in a particular Notes data directory. And when you then kind of structure your Notes upgrades or your hotfix deployment based on assumptions, what happens is a boatload of support calls, right? The help desk basically drowns every time you guys are kind of doing client changes in the dark like this. Because what you can't tell today is who is installed, how, where, who is a shared user that shouldn't be, a single user that shouldn't be, who has admin developer clients installed, or maybe who doesn't even have sufficient memory to run a standard client. And to just kind of put this in perspective, anything kind of after 8 and even more so 8.5, we're no longer talking about the, what is it we had before, 750 files that Notes 7 and before kind of consisted of. Now we're talking about an absolutely massive amount of files and data and preferences that you guys are managing. We're talking about 17,000 files in the Notes program directory. Most of them are largely undocumented. I know this will shock you, but undocumented property files, jar files, HTML files, tons of empty directories, 1,800 directories in total. We're talking about 3,000 files in the Notes data workspace directory in the standard client, which is where a lot of Eclipse stuff happens, right? So 2,400 subdirectories, 1,850 of those are empty. Again, we're talking about largely undocumented XML files, property files. So it's kind of, this is a pretty big deal doing an upgrade on a Notes 8 client. So we're talking about, all in all, 20,000 files, 4,600 subdirectories, 8,500 largely undocumented preference files, XMLs, tons of empty subdirectories. If you guys have dug into all that good stuff before, you You all know about this. About 100 NSFs and NTFs, which typically just kind of get drug around from version to version with each upgrade, and then of course the notes INI. But wait, it gets better. We also have approximately 80 preference dialogs. Some of these interface with Eclipse. So we're talking about approximately 12,000 settings across your address book, notes INI, XML files, things like embedded browsers and docking the Open Launcher. These are all things that you want to kind of standardize and be able to set an expectation with your users. Okay, so how can we help with all that? How can we help with the kind of upgrade problem? Well, we talked about earlier MarvelClient Analyze, which still is free. So at least now you're able to see what's going on. And then what MarvelClient Upgrade can do for you is basically do a touchless upgrade for all of your users regarding of how they're configured. Since we already know everything about every Notes user, we know what you have installed, we know where you have it installed, we know where your user data is, including the whatever orphaned archives outside the data directory. We already know this stuff, so we absolutely know how to grab all that information, move it to a standardized directory or whatever. One of the things that we do, we call it our smart file downloader. We're able to deploy even huge, what 852 is, I think 520 megs or something ridiculous like that. So we can download basically in a throttled way over time even huge upgrade packages or hotfixes or same-time installs or whatever it is you want to users over time. Basically, we take those huge files and we break them into smaller chunk size. And then we deploy that to users based on conditions. So again, you don't want to shove a 520 meg file down a user's throat that's on VPN, right? So we're able to adapt in a very intelligent way to each user's unique situation. And then once all the components are available locally, required for whatever upgrade you're doing, the user is presented with a little screen very similar to the Smart Upgrade. Basically says, are you ready to upgrade or not? User can delay that, but then once the upgrade happens with MarvelClient, which typically does an uninstall of the existing client, moves the user's data to a standardized directory, and then installs this new package, and then of course seamlessly and transparently sets it up in the background. And Notes comes up, new version, all the user's data is still there, and you're good to go. So touchless upgrades while being able to standardize users, which is really just a beautiful thing. Okay, let's talk about Eclipse, and I think this is our last real topic in this session. So typical Eclipse management, we talked about kind of the impact of Eclipse, or really kind of what happened when Eclipse was introduced. A lot of functionality is here, but I would actually be pretty surprised if you guys had done a whole lot of stuff with sidebars and plugins and things like that, which is a shame because it's really great functionality, has a lot of potential. But the reality is that this involves some pretty complex management and a lot of tools that actually don't even exist today, even natively by IBM. So we're talking about having to deploy trusted and side plugins, and I don't know if any of you have ever taken the time to go through the plugin signing process, but let's just say it's not pretty and it's very complex, very time-consuming, and honestly a lot of people just kind of give up, which really is a shame because there's a lot of functionality here that is wonderful. Another thing that kind of works against you guys, well, us too, I suppose, but that is kind of an issue with Eclipse is that it kind of changes a little bit with every version, sometimes with point releases, but, so even if you maybe figured out how to edit or manage a plugin customization file, what happens is in the next version of Notes, that's kind of out the window because that preference now lives somewhere else. It's really complex. Eclipse is really complex. So I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with dealing with instances of a particular preference versus a default for users, but it gets really kind of complex in how to manage all this, manage preferences, even same-time communities, things like that. So it's great functionality, but kind of very difficult to implement. And then we talked about roaming before, support. This is very costly stuff, basically. So how can we help? The solution, MarvelClient Eclipse. What this allows you to do basically is to communicate directly with the Eclipse framework. So we can manage Eclipse components, we can change, add, query, delete components, plugins, preferences, basic things like that you may want to include in your kind of perfect node setup, such as docking the open launcher, setting embedded browsers, hiding the feed reader. Amen to that one. Things like that really allow you to really help your users make the most out of the functionality while not having to answer a million support calls. And obviously, I'm exaggerating. We can also help you deploy or undeploy plugins. One of the problems with the widget catalog is it's not very granular, so it's kind of an all or none. Once something is in the widget catalog, I can't say stuff like I want everybody but people in the Caribbean to be able to do this. It's kind of an all or nothing. So with MarvelClient, you can get as granular as you want. You can deploy stuff to a user, a group, a condition, such as, do this to Mac users only, which is totally random, but, or do this to everybody but Mac users, for example. And then this one is really great, being able to manage same-time communities. So we can add same-time communities, we can change them, we can merge them. If you ever look at your user's configuration, you'll be shocked at how many same-time communities they have, named slightly different, but pointing to the exact same thing. Or maybe they're all pointing to the same thing, but logging in as different people, meaning F. Tanner or Francie Tanner or fully canonical Francie Tanner, whatever it is. So being able to kind of remotely and very selectively manage same-time communities is a huge value add. We have a customer right now dealing with the same-time server consolidation that is using this to kind of do all this remotely for their users. So, quick summary. We've talked a lot about what MarvelClient can do. Just as an FYI, to give you a very brief insight into the architecture, what's involved, basically very simple actually. It's one DLL that needs to get deployed to clients in a variety of ways, a lot of which we provide to you. One single DLL on the user side, and then a couple of Notes I and I entries, and you see them on my screen. Basically, we hook into the extension manager line, and at that point, from the moment the user double-clicks on Notes, MarvelClient is in control. We can execute things before login, after login. About a minute into the Notes session, we can execute things that shut down, or then in real time, like I showed you earlier. Quick overview of all the different modules. I don't want to spend really too much time on this one, just kind of an FYI. We do have several modules. They're mix and match. We do have packages too, but you can basically buy what you want and not bother with the rest. So most of these I've shown you actually. So real-time roaming, upgrade, Eclipse, manage, things like that. Typically, we see a payback period of anywhere between 2 to 6 months, which really is incredible. But basically, this keeps you from having to manage IT or Lotus Notes problems on a one-to-one basis. Because the reality is, if you decommission, let's go with the same-time server example, and you have 500 users pointing to that, you have no way to kind of take that away from those 500 users, and all you can do is wait for 500 people to call the help desk saying, something's not working. But with MarvelClient, one action allows you to kind of manage everybody in the environment, or everybody that makes sense. So everybody on VPN, or everybody on a Mac, or everybody on Linux, or whatever it is. So basically, kind of all in all, what we do, we can help you significantly reduce your administration effort, your project duration and effort required, your cost of data storage and data transfer, while significantly improving your end user's Notes experience. And that's a really fun one. So one of the things that we can do is make a significant improvement in Notes client performance, or Notes client startup. Up to 70% is one of the things that we advertise. So just being able to kind of fix all these things for users while making their notes client faster. This is really great stuff. Another quick summary. This is the example on the bottom left that I wanted to show you guys. So one of the really cool projects that we did, which was for a 120 user shop, they had 200,000 replicas on across 200 servers, and they wanted to consolidate, because obviously supporting 200 servers is very expensive. They consolidated that into 40 servers. We had another client with 140,000 users with 250,000 replicas on 1,300 servers. They went to 90 servers. And you know, with MarvelClient, how many support calls they had because of the migration? 0. And I kid you not, because we can execute up to 10,500 actions per second, we were able to kind of dynamically adjust all these things for all users in a staged way, along with, you know, however fast they were actually moving these replicas and databases, all in the background, transparent to users, which is really wonderful. So, as you already kind of learned earlier, we can do 100% successful initial node setups and ongoing client configuration. We can help you tremendously with reducing your network, your bandwidth, and your disk drive requirements. We can help make notes faster, have less support calls, have shorter projects, and just plain less traffic. So, okay, we made it in time. This is fantastic. My name is Francie Tanner. I will be happy to answer questions or email slides or provide those free licenses that we talked about. But until that, I thank you for your time, everyone. Thank you very much.